Right.
This is an interview with Reynold Ruslan Feldman. Has a PhD. He's an author, educator, tutor, and a longtime Subud member with various jobs in Subud. Reynold, can we start by telling us how you found and came into Subud?
Okay. So I graduated from college in 1960 with my bachelor's, and I didn't know what I wanted to do. I thought I wanted to go to graduate school, but I decided to take a year off and live with my parents in Chicago. My mother, my sister, my older sister was having her second child in Argentina, and my mother didn't trust the Argentine doctors, so she went down to supervise. So my dad and I ended up babysitting each other, and that year I did all kinds of different things. Um, I didn't get a really permanent job, but I tutored and worked for my father, who had his own grain brokerage business on the Chicago Board of Trade and on the Mercantile Exchange. So I just sort of basically became a gopher and typist for his activities for that year. Anyway, we lived in the near north side of Chicago, and a couple of blocks away was a European cafe called the Bonton. And I used to go there all the time. Several of the women who worked there were German, so I spoke German with them. And then I had a quote girlfriend who was a French au pair for Sergeant Shriver, who at that time was living in Chicago. So I used to go in there and speak French with her, speak German with the waitresses. So this guy who was a taxi driver liked to go there too, and he came in, and I was sitting by myself on this particular day. And so he came over to me and said, "Excuse me, are you German or French?" And I said, "I'm American." Oh. And the guy turned out to be Raymond Sherwans, or Lucian Sherwans as he is now. And he, I was a huge East Coast intellectual guy, prep school, Yale, all that. And he said, "Have you ever heard of a guy called Gurdjieff?" I said, "No." So he started bringing me Gurdjieff books, and I got really interested. And so I said, "Well, is there a group here?" He said, "Well, there is, but I don't go there anymore. I found something even better. But I didn't want to tell you about that first because you're such an intellectual, and the Gurdjieff Uspensky works has, all these 7 levels. I mean, not that Subud doesn't, but it's much more intellectual. And I figured I'd start you off with that." So that same night when he told me about Subud, I went with him to this Chicago Fine Arts Building where we exercised on the 11th floor. And about maybe 6 weeks later, I was sitting outside the women's Ladihan because we did sequential Ladihans, and outside the door, and I guess I started doing movements and all kinds of things. So the 3 helpers came up and sort of looked down at me, and they were laughing. They said, "Okay, come back on Friday and we'll make an honest man of you." So it was a wonderful 3. It was Mahmoud Moody, as he later was, and Rozak von Hohenstein, as he later was as well, and also a wonderful former Jesuit priest by the name of Harrington MacDonald. And the 3 of them opened me. It was a lovely opening. And I had a great 5-star opening. And I never missed a Ladihan after that. My Subud birthday will be May 22nd, and I'll be 64 Subud years old. So I hope God will still need me and feed me when I'm 64.
Well, how was your first Ladihan? What did you feel?
It was very, very dramatic. I mean, at first I was standing there, And then the thought went through my mind, oh, nothing's going to happen. And no sooner did that thought go through my mind that I reenacted a scene where I was in a forest with a lot of other people who were standing in front of a trench, which they just dug. And somebody came behind me and shot me in the head right here. And, but before that happened, I said in German, nein, nein, warum? No, no, why? And it was always interesting to me. I spent my junior year as an exchange student at Heidelberg University in Germany. And within 6 months, my German was so good that people asked me what part of Germany I came from. Twice, a taxi driver in Heidelberg driving me to the train station refused the fare because when they found out I was an American and I could speak German the way I did, they said, "We take no money from you." Happened twice with two different drivers. It's really interesting. And I love Germany. And it was really strange. Later on, many years later, in fact, I was at a Lutheran adult summer camp up on Lake Wenatchee in your state in Washington, called Holden Village. Had been a Canadian copper mine, and the Lutheran Church nationally took it over and turned it into a camp retreat site. So I was on the faculty for about a week and doing a course on wisdom. And several of the nights we had entertainment, singers, mimes, whatever. And this one guy was a Lutheran pastor from the Seattle area who worked with trauma victims. And he did hypnotic therapy, including, as it turned out, as a Lutheran pastor, rather unusual, past life regressions. He regressed me. I again had that experience of being shot. But this time I found out that I was a Jewish German boy, 16 years old, who lived in Berlin. And I had been shot pre-extermination camps, where they were just taking people out in a field, having them dig a long trench, and they would just shoot them and push them in the trench, cover it over. And it made so many things make sense because my first wife, Simone, was German, from Germany. And we had a great relationship. So anyway, being dead in that opening Ladihan was awesome. And suddenly this baritone voice said to me, you have to go back down. And I said, I don't want to go back down. This is great here. I really like it. Well, you don't really have a choice. You have to go back down. And it was in like that picture, It's a Wonderful Life, where the angel in training, Clarence, goes down through the clouds. And then you see in his case, where it was in New England. In my case, I came down through the clouds and I saw Manhattan, which was where I was born in 1939. And that's what it was. And then at that point, I got up and started dancing around the room, very happy. And then the helper said, finish.
Wow.
So I had a kind of a 5-star opening where I died, was reborn, and I was literally a born-again Subud member, you might say.
So did you feel like you had moved out of your body in that experience?
No, the death thing is I just fell to the ground in the Ladihan Hall and just felt the most relaxed and carefree of any time in my quote life up till that point. I was 21 and a half years old. And it was something totally unexpected, except as I write in my memoir, um, when I was 7 years old, my mother came in and prayed the "Now I lay me down to sleep" prayer with me, and then turned off the light, closed the door, and went out. And I became deathly afraid. I said, I don't want to die before I wake. I haven't done anything yet. I'm just a kid. I'm only 7 years old. Come on, God, don't make me die. And my first experience with this voice that wasn't my voice was the voice of a middle-aged baritone, and I was a 7-year-old tenor or boy soprano, I guess, said to me, "No one is too young to die, but you don't worry, you'll live to be quite old." And even said a year, how long, but I'm too superstitious, or he said an age. So I don't like to say what that age is. Still older than what I am now at 85 and a half, but in any case, yeah. So, and from time to time, that voice would come to me and tell me stuff, what I should do, what I shouldn't do, and so forth. So I did have experience with inner guidance. And another example, just a quick one, is my father was not religious because his mother had been hyper Orthodox, or was, and forced him, to go to Jewish parochial school in the afternoon after public school. And he wanted to go out and play baseball with the other kids. He didn't understand what the Jewish God had against playing baseball during the week after school. Anyway, there was a whole sequence of events where apparently they had a rabbi come into their house, he and his younger brother Murray. And this rabbi was very, very liberal with the rulers, sort of like the nuns used to be, and would hit the boys on their wrist when they didn't know their Hebrew lesson and stuff. So finally, my father and my uncle, who were 12, and my uncle was maybe 10, they agreed, look, I'll hold him and you give him a taste of his own medicine. He was an old guy. So they did that. Well, afterward, he went complaining, Mrs. Feldman, your boys, they were hitting me. So she goes in with grandpa's leather belt and she gives them what for, because they were beating a rabbi, a holy man. And then my grandpa, who was more like Zorba the Greek, they were the original odd couple. He came home, found out from the boys what had happened, and he took his leather belt and beat my grandma. So anyway, my father was extremely bright, and he graduated like first in his class in Central High School, Philadelphia, in 1920. And he was Jewish families back then, they would give you a violin or give you piano lessons. He had piano lessons, and he became so gifted that he won a full scholarship to the Curtis Institute of Music in Philly. And because my father came to the boys when they were, in high school, my father just graduated, and says, boys, your mother's a tough woman. I can't take it no more. I'm going to sea. And he was cook on merchant marine vessels. So my father is the oldest person, the oldest child of the three boys at that point, had to give up his scholarship and start working as a Western Union runner to support the rest of the family. 15, never did get higher education. He always played the piano, but always with a kind of sense of nostalgia. And so he had nothing to do with the Jewish religion. So when I was 12, my grandma, who lived to be 94, said to him, Jack, if the boy isn't bar mitzvah, I will die and curse you from my deathbed. So my father wasn't religious, but he was definitely superstitious. So I wasn't prepared at all. So he went to my grandma's temple in New York City. At that time, they were living in New York, the Upper West Side. And he basically bribed the rabbi to do my part of the bar mitzvah service. And I read a transliteration of the prayer before and after reading the Torah. So it was the morning minyan, there were about 50 of these old guys who could do the prayers by heart at about 60 miles an hour. And they looked up at me and I knew exactly what they were thinking. They were thinking, here in our view is the death of Israel. I mean, they looked up with such contempt at me. And then that voice came to me and said, look, we don't care what religion you're in, or even if you have one. But if you have a religion, never make a mockery of it. So that was the kind of message I would get from time to time.
Oh, wow.
And then I had a lovely relationship with my grandma. She would always write me when I was in college these lovely little letters, and she would always write God G-D because the name of God means also the nature of God. Shem in Hebrew means name and nature. And so when they say blessings on you, they say Baruch Hashem, blessed be the name, because you don't want to actually say the name of God, which is too sacred for mortal lips, kind of thing, except for the rabbis or special people. And she started writing these lovely letters to me, dear Stevie, as I was then, how are you, my dear? And I hope God is taking care of you. And she would always say at the end, I'm with lots of love, your grandma Ida. So anyway, yeah. And it was shortly after I graduated. I graduated in June of 1960, and in May of 61, I was open. So I never looked back. It's been a huge blessing. And being a linguist, when I was in graduate school, I met the Indonesian students who were studying there. And they all I became like their mascot because, I knew some Indonesian. So I started actually taking lessons from this guy who was in law school. Many years later at the Sydney conference, the Sydney World Congress, he was the Indonesian ambassador to Australia. And he gave the opening address. He opened the Congress. And he said, I first learned about Subud when I was a young student at Yale University. There was this guy named Feldman who had become a Subud member the year before, and he would come to my house every week for Bahasa lessons. And because of my Bahasa, I was really able to, I learned more and more, and I memorized words and things. So I could interact with Bapak in Indonesian, which is one of the great blessings because he never remembered my name, but he said, oh, yes, that's the professor from Hawaii who knows how to speak Indonesian. So, yeah. So a lot of my really significant experiences in a kind of very junior grade Verinder way were with Bapak, who stayed at my house in Hawaii when we basically started the group in Hawaii. And yeah, Bapak, I drove him around. I took him shopping. That was amazing to take him shopping. And so I had my American Express card, but I didn't make much money, and I was hoping he wouldn't buy anything too expensive. So we go into, I forget which store, one of the big department stores in Honolulu, Liberty House it was. And he stands at the door just inside the entrance, and he kind of looks around like he had his LiDAR, his radar. He looked around there, and he headed right for the men's department. And one of the helpers in our group, Robert Jones, was working there. So Bapak was very happy. Oh, Subud member, anggota Subud, yeah? I said, yeah, Pa, Subud member. And so Robert took care of him. So he bought, I think, a pair of suspenders and 2 pair of socks, paid for it himself. And he looked at me and he said, okay. He knew that I was worried about he was going to go in and buy $200 worth of stuff. And I just, I was a little assistant professor at the university earning all of 9,200 bucks, $9,200 a year. And, just sort of, my wife wasn't working and it was pretty tight. So he looked at me and he smiled. He said, okay. And then at the end of that or another visit to Hawaii, he said, you and your wife come to see Bapak in Europe this summer. Bapak will be in England for their Congress. And I said, okay, Papa says to you, I agree. So we were able to get there and it was great. We got charter flights that were inexpensive from LA, and my wife went to be, and her mother went to Munich to visit family. But she did join me. She went earlier and she joined me in London, and then went up with the London group to the Swanwick Conference Center in the Midlands. Or actually, the Congress was there, but before that, Bapak spent like a week in Leicester, England. And we did great Ladihans in this big hall. I mean, there were like 500 men, a lot of English, but people from all over Europe and some Americans. And in the Ladihan, I was going around in a figure eight, or the infinity sign. And Bapak was doing the same thing in the opposite direction. And whenever he passed, my eyes opened and he pointed at me and laughed. And I got the message, ha, very funny. You do same thing as Bapak. And
Only in reverse, huh?
yeah, only in reverse, exactly. And then later, my wife, our little daughter, who was then 5, and my wife's German girlfriend, and I went to Vienna, where Bapak was spending time.
Do you
And
know what year this was?
when or
Yeah.
where?
What
It
year?
was, let me see. It was, I believe, the summer of 1970.
Okay.
Bapak was on his European tour and he was in Vienna. So we walk in, and it turns out we walked through the room where Bapak and party were resting. And and Bapak looks at me with a big smile and he points at me and he says in English, you again. And he cracked up. And I had an interesting experience there, when he was doing the talk and testing everything. And there were 3 Indonesian diplomats. I think one was from Prague and 2 were from Vienna. And they were like, consuls. They weren't the ambassador, but they were a couple levels down. And so I was speaking with them, and I was sitting with the Indonesian men on the men's side of the room. And the theory in those days is, you would fall asleep at Bapak's talks because, he spoke in Indonesian, your mind turned off, you couldn't really understand it, and you would wake up for the translation. Other people said, no, he's so powerful, it just knocks you out, kind of Bapak anesthesia. But I was subscribing to the theory that it was the language, but I was understanding most of what he was saying. And then I fell asleep, and at one point I opened my eyes, and these 3 Indonesian diplomats, on one side and 2 on the other, they were out cold. So I changed my theory to the theory of Babak's power. But that was Subud, as Reynold likes to say, is a great learning. It's not a teaching, but it's a great learning. And that was another occasion where I really learned something. Yeah. Oh, and something else interesting. When he came to Chicago, and must have been 78, I was that time a dean at the university there, State University. There were a bunch of young kids in our, of our group members. And so these young kids decided they wanted to sing for Bapak. They wanted to sing Old MacDonald. So Sharif asked Bapak and came back to me and said, yes, just tell them not too many verses. So they sang Old MacDonald with maybe 3 or 4 verses. And that was so interesting. At that particular talk, my wife had beautiful Rosenthal, a tea set that she'd gotten for her, when she was getting married, coming over to America in 1963 to marry me. And really beautiful bone china. And Baba was still drinking Coke in those days. So there was one of those small, old-fashioned, very thick green Coke bottles there, and he drank half of it. And so he takes his spoon and he taps the Rosenthal teacup, and it goes bing, bing. And then he taps the Coke bottle, it goes clunk, clunk. And he said, clunk, clunk, that's how you are now. Bing, bing, that's how you will be later if you do your Ladihan with diligence, patience, and sincere acceptance. And there's just these little things. Anyway, he wanted to go see the Sears Tower, as it was then. It was at that time the tallest building in the world. Now it's like number 5 or something. He wanted to go there. So the whole party, with me as driver, piles into the car. I think we got in a big car for him. Piles in. We drive to Chicago from where they were staying in the western suburbs, and in one of our members' houses. And we go to the Sears Tower. On the way back, we go back the same way. And Chicago has these really interesting, I guess they're water towers, the slender stem, and then there's like an egg-shaped thing on top. So I said the word for egg. Aspertitalur. It's like an egg. Oh yeah. Jusperti piringan. Piringan terbang. Piringan terbang is a UFO. Bapak becomes very serious, and he says to me in Indonesian, tell Bapak everything you know about UFOs. I'd already had my suspicions about what they were. I'd had, 3 or 4 sightings and 1 actual telepathic communication with UFO in Hawaii. It was flying over my house. He wanted to know everything. So I told him my various sightings and so forth. And my private feeling is that there's a connection there that we don't know about. But my optimistic theory about UFOs is we're sort of their project. I mean, we're kind of like the prisoner colonies in Botany Bay, or something like that. We're a planet for people who need to develop spiritually and have not done so yet. And that sort of our unseen mentors are the folks in some of these vehicles. And I know there's all kinds of theories. There's also bad guys and this and that and the other. But that's my private theory, and that, Bapak was a special ambassador to help lift the level of the nafsu and kind of get some people who are prepared in another life to go to another place or another dimension. And that's just my private theory. So Subud members out there, don't take it too seriously, but that was just my feeling. But those were the kinds of interactions I had with him over the time. And he loved going up to the top of the Sears Tower. Oh, he's like a kid in a candy shop. He had the best time looking at, oh, this is the tallest building in the world. Wow. He's so cute. It's the only word for it. This old man from a third world country who of course is Bapak, our spiritual guide, but in another way, he was like, how are you going to keep them down on the farm after they've seen Perry? It was seeing the human side of Bapak,
Yeah.
not the Bapak that we knew. So that was kind of fun. Okay, well, it's a lot more than my opening or how I found out about Subud, but you must have other questions.
So how did your Subud life progress after that?
Well, when I was in graduate school, fortunately, there were some there was another Subud member, Raymond Oppenheim. He's one of the young guys in New York, and he was half Jewish, but he later became an Episcopal priest in Wellington, New Zealand. He'd also been the chaplain at the U.S. Embassy in Moscow. He was very brilliant. He spoke Chinese, he spoke Russian, and so the Episcopal Church sent him around to various places. He was there so we could do Ladihan together, but after a year he left, so I was there alone. And then it turned out there was a Subud member in a nearby Connecticut town, and he would come up and do Ladihan with me. And I would get into New York and stay with my aunt and go to the Sunday Ladihan in the city. And that's when I first met Bapak. It was in the time of the Briarcliff Congress. So that must have been 63, I believe.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I've been open for a couple of years. Oh, and then we got a Japanese medical doctor who was also he was an ophthalmologist, but he was doing ophthalmological research at the Yale Hospital, and Dr. Mizuno, and he was there with his wife and his little daughter, Afumi. And he was a Subud member from Japan. So he and I would do Ladihan. So God provided. And to answer your question of how my Ladihan changed, it became normal. In other words, there was kind of a docking. I mean, my early Subud was like the Soyuz and the Apollo doing this pas de deux in near space and then docked. And it was a point probably 5 or 6 years in where the two kind of came together. And it wasn't always, obviously, wasn't always perfect, but Subud just became so instinctive and part of my life. And that's just deepened and become more normal over time. So, like now, I mean, in the beginning, I was a party member, I was a card carrying Subud party member. And I did everything by the book, and twice a week and quiet period. I mean, I did the whole 9 yards. Oh, and I had another experience with Papa after I had a summer job at the Yale Art Gallery as, the guy who sold postcards and gave people directions. And occasionally my boss allowed me to take tours around and stuff like that. I was supposed to work on the weekend when Bapak, after the Congress, Bapak was coming down to New York, and he especially wanted to speak to all the people who were unable to come to the Congress, as I was, because I had to work. And I tested about it, and I knew it was the right answer because it said, no, you can't go. You need the money. You have to stay here. Very practical. So I did, but I was disappointed. So there was a young woman who was working with me, and we switched weekends so that I could go for that whole weekend, Friday night to Sunday night in New York. It was terrific. I mean, Bapak gave talks, he tested with us and so forth. And when I came back, I felt like I'd really been gypped because my friends, the other young guys in the group who were like Raymond Oppenheim and Wallace Klein, they'd been there, they'd worked the Congress, they'd been in all the Ladihans and all the things. And I became sad and I said, they got so much and I just got this one evening, with talking and testing and all that. I wasn't a test group. That was at least a good thing. And Bapak showed up in my room in New Haven and said, "Why are you sad?" And so, of course, he knew why. And he said, "You and your friends got exactly the same amount from Bapak. In the case of your friends, Bapak poured slowly. In your case, Bapak poured fast." Sama, you got the exact same thing that you would have gotten if you'd worked the whole Congress and been with Bapak the whole time. It was like I felt so ashamed being, judging these things by worldly quantitative standards and not qualitative standards. And I really got that in the world of the spirit. It's different. It's not like in the material world where 10 is twice as good as 5 or twice as much. Bapa Porf, slow for your friends, but fast for you. You all got sama, just the same. So these were the learnings that I got. Oh, and in my first year of graduate school, I was living in the 6th floor of a quote local high rise, and had a couple of roommates, and I got there first before my 2 roommates arrived, and I was all by myself. No, that was wrong. It was around the time of my birthday, November 6th, and I'd gone to a talk by the Sterling professor of literature, a Czech man by the name of Dr. René Wellick, Wellek, internationally famous guy. He gave this lecture in which he was quoting things in Russian, in Polish, in French, and all these German, all these different languages. And I came home and my roommates weren't there at that time. I was all alone in the apartment. And I was absolutely depressed. I said, "You will never be able to do anything like that. You will never reach the level of Dr. Wellick." And I got 1 foot outside my window. And a gentle voice said inside me, "Don't worry." And I was also at that point 2 months into my first year of graduate school. And as an undergraduate, I'd been kind of the top dog, I shined Phi Beta Kappa magna cum laude from Yale. I was a big shot. But suddenly in Yale graduate school in English, we had all the big shots from places like Bryn Mawr and Stanford and University of Chicago. It was, like before I'd been running in college track, and now suddenly I was running with Olympic people. It's like, wow. And I used to be a star, and suddenly it was all gone. I was struggling to do well. Eventually I did fine. So this voice said to me in my ear, "Oh, just pull that leg back in. You're going to be fine. You'll do very well. Just come back in. God is taking care of you." That was the only time I tried to commit suicide. And the Ladihan was right there, right at the point of purchase. Fortunately, I listened. And of course, it was true. At the end, I did very well in my PhD program, and, Dr. Feldman. My parents were always saying, "Oh, with your mind, you could have been a lawyer, you could have been a doctor. You had to become a professor, the worst paid of all the learned professions." And I said, "Dad, I didn't get the businessman or the lawyer or the doctor genes. I got the rabbi genes." And because I'm not really an active Jew, although I tried in graduate school, it was just a bridge too far. I joined a conservative youth group, and I had a great experience, but I just knew this wasn't for me. And then turned out 58 years, 58 years ago, in March 4th, on my wife's birthday, I was baptized together with water from the Jordan brought by Francis von Kaller, who who gave away the bride at our wedding in New Haven 10 days after JFK was assassinated, 9 days, November 30th of that year, 63. And he was also my godfather at my baptism. Francis was terrific at our wedding. We'd gotten telegrams in German as well as English. So he read all the German telegrams and translated them into English. And then he started reading the English telegrams and translated them into German. And my professor, the guy I was being a graduate assistant for, also the biographer of Emily Dickinson, a famous professor by the name of Richard Sewell, came up to me and said, "So, Steve, where did you get this guy from? He's terrific." He thought he was a professional comedian. I mean, he did this whole Francis thing, the whole Hamburg English kind of a deal. He was terrific at the wedding. Yep. So, yeah, just Subud has always been there for me. It's just always been there. And I was baptized because Simone used to read the cards, my first wife. She had some German way of reading a card deck and predicting things. So she predicted for us that she would have twins. Well, she didn't. She just had our first of two daughters, Mariana. But the same day that Mariana was born, I was supposed to deliver my doctoral dissertation to the Yale faculty. I was teaching at Queens College, and we were living in Flushing near the World's Fairgrounds, 1939 fair. Used to tease my mother because my parents didn't drink. But when she was pregnant with me, they were living in Brooklyn, I think, that time. And she would go to the World's Fair, and she had a yen for German beer. So she would go to the German pavilion and drink beer. It's the only time in her life she ever drank beer. When she was pregnant with me, she was drinking German beer. So one more indication. And yeah. So anyway, I brought my dissertation in a day later. They said, "Well, check, and if your wife and the baby are okay, come up here the day after, or maybe it was 2 days after, and give us a dissertation." So I did. I brought the 2 bound copies and delivered them to the faculty. And I had an appointment. And we didn't know whether our child would be raised as a Jew or as a Christian. Francis came back from the Holy Land, and he gave us this vial of holy water from the Jordan River, which the Arabs, the Palestinians, were selling at the place where Jesus supposedly been baptized by John the Baptist. And he says, "Man, I do not know if you want this, but just throw it away if you don't want it." And it was like Simone and I looked at each other and said, "This child will be baptized a Christian." So I had an appointment the afternoon I was in New Haven with the Lutheran campus pastor, Pastor Olson, Richard Olson, who had married us, to ask him if he would be willing to baptize Mariana. Well, I was waiting for him in the chapel before I went to his office because I had about 15 or 20 minutes. And I'm just sitting there minding my own business. And the voice comes to me and says, "You should be baptized with your daughter." And I'm like, no one was around. Yale hadn't started yet. It was like September 2nd or 3rd. None of the Yaleys were around. totally empty place. He said, well, I'll prove it to you. You see those books over there? There were little Episcopal prayer books, the 1928 Book of Common Prayer. The Episcopal students used it for their Wednesday communion service. Said, go over there, open one of those books, just open it at random, and you'll see what I'm telling you was correct. So I did it, with an all points prayer. Moses, Jesus, Bapak, prevent me from the greatest sin for a Yale man, doing something stupid. They want to do something stupid. So I went over and I opened the book at random. It's a 900-page book. I opened it to the only 2 pages in there for the baptism of a new adult Christian. I lost it. I felt as if a heavy backpack had been snipped off my back with a pair of garden shears. And I was just crying like crazy. And I felt totally washed by this. At this point, I've been in Subud about 2.5 years. Okay, I'll be baptized. So I go over and I tell Pastor Olson, I blurt out, like, how are you, Steve? How's Simone? She wasn't Simone yet. How's Hannah and the baby? And everybody's fine. And then I blurt out this story. So he had just been down in the South with Martin Luther King on one of their walks. I don't know if it was a Selma one or something. And, he's like many of these liberal Protestants. He was way into the civil rights movement and with King and all that. So he's sitting there, nice Lutheran pastor from North Dakota. And his dad and his grandfather before him, they'd been Lutheran pastors, the grandfather in the old country in Norway. So he said, well, I know that things like that happen. It's in the Bible, obviously, God talks to people or something. But my grandfather, who was a Lutheran pastor in Norway, never had an experience like that. And my father, if he had one, never told me about it. And I, have been a Lutheran pastor for 20 years now. I've never had like a voice come to me and tell me stuff. And as he was talking, Bapak's upper torso and head floated in the room above his head, and Bapak had his Cheshire cat grin on, sort of like, the one that he used with me a lot. He would see me and he would crack up, I struck him funny. But I knew it was the right thing. And so I'd just gotten my Subud name. I guess Simone had gotten hers just then too. And I remember the morning when the letter came, Simone and I had a practice. If either of us had what seemed like a significant dream, we would share it to see whether it meant anything. I'd had a dream that night, sort of toward the morning, in which, like in Mission Impossible, I was going by a phone booth outside somewhere, and the phone rings and I go and pick it up, and the voice, that same middle-aged baritone that had talked to me when I was 7 and from thereafter, said, how do you like the name Reynold? My birth name was Stephen Michael. How do you like Reynold? And I'm like, it's okay, I guess. That afternoon, Simone calls me in my office at Queens College and said the letter came from Indonesia. So I said, is it Reynold? She said, yes. And Bapak also gave you the meaning of Reynold for you. And it said, in your case, the name Reynold means having firm feelings. And I was a little bit wishy-washy, I have to say. I would go with the flow. Having firm feelings. A person whose feelings are firm, that's how they put it, as Siddhartha put it in the letter. So, over these 64 now years, I've been blessed with guidance, support. I was a Lutheran because that's what Simone was for 37 years. And then in Hawaii, I was told that I really needed to become Catholic. So I became Catholic, Roman Catholic for 7 years. And the Diocese of Honolulu was way laid back. I mean, hula in the church and these Hawaiian priests, hey, take it easy, bro. Don't sweat it. They were not like any Catholic priest that, you hear about. They were really very laid back and very undogmatic.
Yeah.
So when I got to Boulder, I was still Catholic, got to Boulder in May of 2009. And I start going to the Catholic Church. And the Archdiocese of Denver, to which we belong, is very conservative. I mean, they loved the German Pope. He was in the Denver Catholic every month, pictures, the Holy Father, Benedict this and Benedict that. When Francis came along, he was never in the Denver Catholic. He was way too liberal for these guys. And I was once, it was Christmas Eve, and Cedar, who was raised in an old line congregational family in New England from the 1640s. I mean, her folks were there forever with the pastors, congregational ministers, and even a witch. I mean, they had the whole line there. Catholic Church was a bridge too far for her. She was a Quaker at that point when we met. But she decided on Christmas Eve to go to this. I was now going to the University Catholic Church because I was told that was somewhat more liberal. So the associate pastor there, the priest, on Christmas Eve preached on demon possession. I couldn't sleep that whole night. And in the morning, I knew I was done with being a Catholic. So Cedar and I, my current wife, oh, I didn't tell you this part. Before she died in Hawaii, Simone, my wife at that point, 43 years, we did home hospice. She told me about 10 days before she passed of pancreatic cancer. Reynold, you are younger than me. I was almost 9 years younger. And you are still active, and I think you will not be alone for long after I go. But when I'm on the other side, if it's permitted, I will help you find somebody good. Because maybe you don't choose so good yourself. I mean, visions of some 25-year-old blonde bimbo or something. It's like, wait, I said, I chose you, didn't I? She says, well, you can be lucky once. And 2.5 years after she died, I mean, I was in DC staying with Lori Lathrop, and then I spent a week, and then I stayed with Helena Buzak and her family out in rural Maryland. And I actually was discerning in an English Benedictine monastery where half of the brothers and priests were professors at nearby Catholic University, whether I should become a Benedictine monk. Lasted a week. I loved my time there, but at the end of the week, it was very clear I was designed to be in the world. So, and Helena, who's Catholic, our still international helper, Helena Busak, she used to call me, oh, my little Catholic. She was so cute, with her New York accent. Anyway, I was going somewhere with this point, and I think I've landed in the woods, so I'll just shut up. I can't remember what I was going to say.
I am checking something here, and I'm not sure that we've been recording.
Oh, too
I
bad.
thought I had touched the record button, and I'm looking at it now, and there's a thing that says record.
Can you see if there's anything there?
I can't tell.
So you know what? If there's nothing there, let's do it again on another date because I think I'm getting close to the end of my capacity to talk.
Yeah, I understand. I don't understand what happened,
Well,
but
this was a fun dress rehearsal. Just
well, it was great. I mean, I'm really happy to hear your stories.
my book, uh, one of the 12 that I wrote, mainly after I retired. I wrote a couple while I was actually still a professor. Is this one?
Yeah,
And so it seems that, and Virendra had like 12 or 15 young guys, young Subud members that he considered staunch Subud members, the bringing in the future, these young guys. Well, I was one of them. Garrett Thompson was another one, and the guy up in Norway, um, um, Rukman Hendadi, who started that whole ICDP program. He was another one. So wherever and then frankly, he also had a crush on my wife, my German wife. He would say, Simone, in the next life, we'll be together. But yeah, he would always stop by and he mentored me. And he mentored all the rest of these young guys, Garrett and Rukman and other ones around the world. So yeah, so I was a junior grade storyteller in the image of my late wife, who was a great storyteller, and also Virendra. And I dedicated this book to my late wife, saying, if I can find the page, this book is dedicated with gratitude and love to Simone Zimmerman Feldman, the best story I know. She's now telling the angels a tale or two. So, and my dad was a good storyteller too.
yeah.
He would always end up riding on trains like the 20th Century Limited or the Super Chief back in the pre-plane days. And he would end up playing pinochle with Dean Martin and Jerry Lewis, or drinking with Danny Kaye, in a private car somewhere. And he was a great storyteller. And they would say, Jack, you shouldn't be in the grain business. You should be in our business. You're a terrific storyteller. You're a great entertainer. But he never did that. But he always produced the Board of Trade, or the place in New York where he worked, number 2 Broadway. It was the Produce Exchange. He always produced for many years, their annual show. And he's convinced that he discovered Diane Carroll, whom I met with him, and Eva Marie Saint. He knew all these fancy entertainment people. And yeah. Oh, and one time he was at a grain convention in someplace in Texas, I guess, on maybe Corpus Christi. And it was dry, so they went to a speakeasy after their day of conventioning, these grain dealers. And at this particular give speakeasy, the piano player didn't show up. So my dad sat down at the piano, and he could play anything by ear. And you could give him a request, any request. He knew all the 20s, 30s, 40s songs, 50s maybe too. And he would just play them. So the owner of this place came up to him and said, Jack, give you $75 a week and all the food and the booze you can drink, and all the food you can eat. And he said, nah, well, I have this job back in New York City. My family's there. So he said no. But when he told the story, you could hear it. I mean, his fellow grain dealers were saying, you probably just turned down the best offer you've ever gotten in your life. And I think he always had a certain nostalgia about, I mean, he could just play, he had a great touch on the piano, and it's just all these old songs, and he just was so connected with that. Or he played Claire de Lune, he could play classical stuff by heart too. Beautiful.
So do you
Anyway,
feel like you could go through this again?
yeah,
And
well, it might come out differently because I just sort of
yeah,
go
I
with the
know.
flow. So maybe some of the same stories, but also different ones. Or if I tell them, although Cedar, my current wife, tells me, who's now a Subud helper and everything, but she she says a lot of times you use the exact same words to tell the story. So it may be the same, but I'll just go like I go, to see what happens.
Yeah. What time would work for you?
Um, okie dokie, let me look. I think I could do it this Friday at 8 o'clock again, or um, Monday, Wednesday, and Fridays are typically my best days. So next week, Monday, Wednesday, or Friday at 8 o'clock as well.
Okay, Friday would work for me if that works for you.
This coming Friday,
Yeah.
28th, yeah, it should work for me. I don't have anything else in my book. Just put it down. 8 o'clock. Do some rehearsing on the recording.
This was a great rehearsal.
It was a good
Sorry I couldn't get
rehearsal,
it
yeah.
on tape.
Okay, Rahman. Interview. And who knows, maybe you did get something there.
I'll check it once.
Yeah, once we're done. And in case you did, I could finish up with a final kind of completion story, like where am I now?
Yeah.
Something like that, just final few minutes. So thank you,
Okay.
brother.
Thank you, my
as
friend.
as I was in a Ladihan back in the days when they had the O Group in Subud, New York, and Francois Farkas, the great Hungarian gentleman and filmmaker, uh, had the O Group that night as the helper, and it was a hot August night in New York City, and people were dressed down to their underwear. I mean, there was no AC in this warehouse building, one of Subud's places in New York. We were on the top floor, and a couple lazy fans were going around. It must have been 100 degrees. And he was dressed up with his Dax and his beautiful French cuffs and cufflinks, and never broke a sweat. He's impeccably dressed. And at the end, I mean, and people were writhing on the floor and making the most horrible noises, it was terrible things. He goes to the door very dramatically, turns back, and said, "Gentlemen, it was a pleasure." Opens the door and goes out and closes it behind him. I'll never forget that, gentleman. It was a pleasure. Very Farkas. We had in Subud, New York in those days, we had characters.
Yeah.
Reynold Osborne, when I got Reynold, he said, "Now, Reynold, remember, I'm Reynold 1 and you're Reynold 2." Reynold Osborne, they're incredible characters. There's a guy from, I think, the Ukraine, forget his name. He was a a building painter in New York City up on the 70th floor of some building, doing stuff on the outside of the building. Richard Stecco, his name was. I remember now. And Walter Siegel. I mean, there was a collection of characters in Subud, New York, like you would not believe. Lucienne Farkas, who when Bapak came, she was always Ibu's lady. And she would come in with perfume and the special kind of fragrance that Bapak liked. And she would come in, sweep into the room. This was in New York in 67 when I was in charge of coordinated the trip there. And she came in and she would say, I am in charge of the soaps and the parfum. I mean, there were characters, Julia Schusterman, I could go on. But anyway, we'll save it for another time.
Well, actually, I just checked and I think it actually is recording, although I'm not sure, but I think so. So let's keep going.
All right, well, let's give it something sense of finality. As I mentioned, Subud has become so normal for me now. It's just like, somebody asked the German poet Heinrich Heine how a fish out of water might feel. He said, oh, that's easy, like Heine in Paris. So I've become an amphibian, where the true place where I live is in the water of the Jiwa. But I'm also able, maybe like a whale or like a dolphin, I can also live in the air, unlike fish that breathe with their gills and not their lungs. And more, I'm less and less of a party man. I'm just doing my own thing. Like occasionally my wife and I will test together. And I've met other longtime Subud members who are like, at a certain point in time, you listen to you. And I even did this exercise when I was doing little seminars for people, little wisdom workshops. I did one in Hawaii one time, and I'd created this exercise called sit right down and write yourself a letter. And this is how you do it. We got quiet for a couple of minutes and I said, okay, think of some problem or some issue you're having right now that you have sort of a hung jury about it. 6 of the jurors say do this and the other 6 jurors say do the opposite, and you just can't figure out what to do. So I said, what you do in this letter is you write, dear Rahman, you write your own name in capital R and then the rest small letters. And you tell yourself the answer to your conundrum. And at the end, you write love, and then you write Rahman with all capital letters. Every single one is a capital letter. And I remember I had this successful businesswoman who had some kind of enterprise in Hawaii came up to me afterwards and said, I have been dealing with this problem for 5 years and I could never resolve it. And I just got the obviously perfect answer to my problem. So, some people, they really got something. So I think, all people have that inner capacity to some extent. And so without doing Subud or talking about Subud or Jiwa or using Indonesian terms, I would do stuff like that to give people an experience that they knew more than they thought they did, and they were wiser than they knew. So, and as a teacher, I mean, a number of my students became Subud members. And one of the most illustrious of all is Helena Busak. She was my student in Germany in 1972, 73. She turned 21 that year. Now she's in her 70s. And Her husband was a first lieutenant there, West Point graduate, Jimmy, Subud member, never changed his name. Nice Catholic boy from Bel Air, Ohio. Lovely man. Became an ophthalmologist in the Army. And then he had private practice. And Helena ran the show. I mean, she's a tough New York woman from Staten Island. And the two of them took me under their wing because my wife and my two kids were 8 hours away on the Autobahn in another part of Germany, and I would drive to these military bases and stay in a bachelor's officer's quarter. And so they just became my people who took me in. And the courses I taught for the University of Maryland, their overseas campus, were like 8 weeks, once a week for 3 hours. And they were a full college course, credit course. So I taught all these courses. But if there weren't enough people, the course didn't make, it didn't go. So Helena made sure she browbeat all these people who said, Reynold needs 5 more students now. You're going to take this course. And they were cheap, you know. I mean, the Army paid for them, basically. I always had a full class, thanks to her. Actually had 2 full classes. She took all my classes. And later on, when she had her daughters, when they were like in junior high or high school, she imported me from wherever I was to Dickinson, Maryland, where they lived out in the country in this mansion, and said, Reynold taught me to write. He's teaching you two to write. So I tutored them, and, you know, she would pay me a princely fee because they always had lots of money, and I was like the poor cousin, you know. She's taken care of me for a long time, and they came to Subud, she and Jimmy, through me in Germany, and never looked back. And she's now in her 2nd term as an IH, and she's terrific.
Yeah. So I have a question for you.
Okay.
Daniela Moneta asked me to ask you about the Caribbean. Were you?
Yeah, we went to Cuba.
Okay.
We at the Freiburg Congress. I met and was hanging out with this lovely young woman from Cuba, and she became like a goddaughter. We got very close, and so she invited. She's a Subud kid. Her parents were both early Subud members in Cuba. Her mother was like a national helper there, and her parents, her grandparents had an Airbnb, which they don't do through San Francisco, they do through Barcelona, because they don't have anything commercially to do with the US. And so I went there, Cedar and I went there. I think it was just before COVID. And I was able to raise a lot of money, something like 3,000 euros. And you don't bring dollars there, they won't take dollars, but you bring euros, and they won't take US credit cards. So you have to make sure you have enough money. But I brought in all this money and gave it to the Subud group. And I got actually from our Episcopal church, I'm now an Episcopalian for the past 14 years, very wealthy church in Boulder here. And yeah, I got about $1,000 just from them, and then from friends and family. Took all this, and Subud members I knew, a lot of people put up money, and I took it down there. And so that was my connection. And Laura and her husband, Alexis, who wasn't in Subud, she was in Subud, but actually she's 3rd generation, Laura Duranes. And because her husband had a Spanish grandfather from Spain, under the rules, you could get a Spanish green card. And because she was married to him, she could get one too. So they both, he was a city official, and she's the daughter. Her father is one of the most renowned filmmakers in contemporary Cuba. So she and Alexis, her husband, moved to Valencia, Spain, and got their master's degrees at the University of Valencia and are living there to this day. Because in Cuba, people who make the most money are like the taxi drivers who have these big wads of bills in their wallet because they get paid. If you're a foreigner coming to Cuba, you can't use the Cuban peso. Use something called a CUC, a convertible universal currency, and that's pegged to the euro. So, like when we went to a folklore concert at the National Theater in Havana with them, we took them. Their tickets were like $5 for both of them. Our tickets were like $30 for each of us. So that's how they make a lot of money through tourism. We loved Cuba. We got to go someplace else as well in Cuba, and fabulous country, and we just loved it. Oh, and the grandparents refused to take any money from us to stay in their Airbnb for a week, and so we took them out to a fancy restaurant the last night we were there, and also with Laura and her husband, and totally splurged. And so that was how we dealt with that, because, I mean, it's their livelihood that they have this Airbnb in their apartment. So, yeah, that was, I mean, we've been to the Caribbean before, to Puerto Rico and to the Grand Caymans and some of these other islands on a cruise. But that was our only real Subud venture in the Caribbean. Loved it. So that was that. When you go someplace, and wherever we go, I mean, I'm a linguist. I'm now studying 10 languages simultaneously on Duolingo. It's part of my brain gym because I saw my mother 20 years before she was as old as I am now go into the dark night of the soul. And she became a really cute, funny person with Alzheimer's. A lot of people go south and they become very antagonistic, even physically violent. My mom became totally cute. She'd never been mean, but she was always quite earnest. And she, I was again guided how to be with my mother in her dementia. It's very interesting that way. I sang to her. I did kinesthetic games like the Itsy Bitsy Spider and all that stuff. And she said she didn't know exactly who I was. She knew I was somebody safe, though. And she said, "Oh, for games like that, you can come and play with me anytime." And then I remember I kissed her on her third eye, said, "Oh, you can come back anytime." And we'll dance the night away. Totally cute, adorable. And all the issues I'd had with my mother growing up, because she was very controlling, it's like an invisible hand came with a sponge and just wiped all the debits in my account book with my mother away, and everything was settled. It was such a blessing. And my dad, I opened on his deathbed. And after he died in after he died in Fort Lauderdale, oh, that was an interesting experience. I said, "Dad, I'll pay for as many of your debts as I can afford to, but I have actually another gift for you." Because he'd had an experience where he'd gotten in the tunnel, like in this life after life concept, and he got stuck midway through and he couldn't go all the way through, so he had to go back. And he was so funny. He didn't drink, he didn't smoke, and he didn't gamble, but he was a ladies' man. So he says to me, "Reynold," he said, there's this beautiful young blonde woman, all dressed in white, and she comes and, oh, he didn't tell me this. He told my nephew Robert. She comes in, she talks to me, and Robert said, "Oh, that must be Darlene, the day work." Says, "No, Robert, it's the woman who's going to take me to the other side." And my father would follow a beautiful blonde shiksa anywhere, even into the jaws of death. So thinking to myself, God doesn't send him some old white guy with a long beard to take him over. He sends a beautiful blonde shiksa, to take him to the other side. Anyway, so I said, the other gift I have for you, how you got caught in the tunnel? Well, you know about this thing I've been doing for so many years, the Subud thing, the Latihan. He said, yeah. Well, you can just lie there in bed and I'll do it with you. You don't have to do anything. And it will make it possible for you to get all the way through to the other side. You won't get stuck. And so he says, what could it hurt? At this point, what could it hurt? He always thought he would call Bapak the Hindu Jesus and all this stuff. But what could it hurt? And there was a Subud, Indonesian Subud member who was like a gypsy, Ibu Farida. She was a friend of the old Ibu city, Sumari, and she was working in the Indonesian consulate in Germany when Bapak healed Eva Bartok, Elena Bartok, of her cancer. And that was in all the German, news of the world kind of National Enquirer type of magazine, a big picture of him. And she was in the hospital with a cyst on her ovary. And she didn't want some male doctor looking at her private parts. So she was very skeptical. She lying in bed in the hospital the night before operation. And she says, Pak Subu, if you could cure that Hungarian woman of her tumor, you can cure me of mine. The next morning, they did an x-ray before the operation. The tumor was gone. So she found out from the embassy that Bapak at that time was in Munich. And she was, I think, in Bonn, where at that time where the embassy was. And so her colleagues said, you should go down and thank Paksubo for curing you. I mean, Indonesians don't have a hard time believing that that kind of thing can happen. So you should go thank him in person. So she goes down there, and they're guards to keep people from bothering Bapak and Ibu. When they saw this Indonesian woman all dressed up in her kain and kabaya, they figured she was part of the party. I mean, what did these Germans know? So she just goes right in. And she was a longtime friend of Ibu's, but had lost track of her, didn't know she was Mrs. Bapak now. So she goes in, and Ibu says, Farida, what are you doing here? And she said, and she was Sukarno's palmist. And she told him not to do this whole thing with Malaysia, the confrontasi and so on. So he kicked her out, he fired her. But she was sort of the Jean Dixon of Indonesia in terms of palmistry. She was the big palmist, very famous. So she tells Ibu the story of how she'd been in the hospital a week before with this tumor. And she saw a big picture of Bapak on the cover of this, whatever the magazine, the newspaper was. And she said, Bapak, if you can cure that Hungarian woman, you can cure your countrywoman, me, Farida. And he cured her without even being there, just by her putting that out. The doctors couldn't believe it, but they had the before and after x-ray, knew it was the same person, no tumor, next day. So Ibu said, go in the next room and tell Bapak. Oh, and by the way, read his palm. So she goes in there, and Bapak, of course, knew of her. And she tells him the story. She says, after we talk, you go into Ibu and be opened. So she got open in that Munich hotel back in early on 1958 or 57 or something. And he said, read Babak's palms, puts out his hand. Bapak, you have the same lines on your hand as the Prophet Muhammad. Because his hand is famous in Islamic countries among the, you have the same line. Bapak said, yeah, Bapak born on the same day, the same month, different year, the same time as the Prophet Muhammad, on whom be peace. So she was a great character. She was also a big flying saucer, the flying saucer. And so I was in Chicago. She would always come stay with us, like Veranda or wherever we were. So in Chicago, she says, Dr. Allen Hynek, J. Allen Hynek, the famous flying saucer professor, is here at the University, Northwestern University. He's head of the astronomy department at Northwestern. But in his home in Evanston, he actually had the office of his nonprofit flying saucer investigative branch. He had headed up Project Blue Book, and the federal government wanted him to find swamp gas or any kind of explanation to prove that nothing was real. It was all illusory. But as a scientist, he said there are 5% of all the cases I've studied which can't be explained by swamp gas or hot air balloon or an airplane or anything. So he stopped working for the government. He had backbone. And so anyway, I called up and I said, Madam Farida from Indonesia is here. And she's a flying saucer person from there, like to meet. Oh, of course. And he gave us a tour of the observatory at Northwestern, and we went to his house. We took him out to lunch. Lovely man. And he, of course, was the advisor on Close Encounters of the Third Kind. And there's a picture of him, a cameo, standing there looking at the, when the little UFO people, the aliens come out and, but yeah, so through her, and I also met the then foreign minister and later vice president of Indonesia, Adam Malik, whose hand she had read, and she helped him find a Subud naturopath in Munich who is able to keep Adam Malik's son from going blind.
Oh.
So for the rest of her life, she was protected and funded by Adam Malik. So when he came to Chicago on official business, she had told him, when you're in Chicago, meet Dr. Feldman, Professor Feldman. So I had him come and talk at our university, and then I spent time with him in his hotel room. And again, my being able to speak Indonesian was very handy, because they figure, white people can't speak Indonesian. And I found it so easy. It's a really easy language. So those are my stories, and I'm sticking to them, still doing time. 85 and a half almost. May 6th, I'll be 85 and a half, God willing. And yeah, as long as he wants me to be around, I'll be around. And when time comes to go, then Scotty will beam me up.
Okay.
And that's it.
Thank you very much.
Oh, you're welcome. It was fun.
Yeah. I'm going to stop the recording now.
Okay. And if it turns out that it didn't get recorded, then I'll still be on for Friday. We'll do it again in some form.
I think it worked.
Alhamdulillah, as they say in Arabic.